Welcome to Got Time with Christopher John, your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Much appreciation to my producer, Ron Thomas with TCP, as well as my subscribers. For those who have not, please like, subscribe, and share. This podcast continues to be a candid exchange of thoughts and perspectives where Black history intersects with art, intersects with culture, politics, and all shades of social realities. History is literally occurring in real time as we observe the social landscape of today. Hence, it is critical for us to revisit a peculiar time in our history relevant to our current situation. I believe we are amid the age of incivility. Now, what does it mean to be civil? Civil has several meanings. One meaning is to be cultured and polite. Another meaning is to describes things related to our community of people, their government, and that relationship between the people and the government. Since naming things is currently such a great concern, I've often wondered, why do we call the Civil War the Civil War? Why do we call that war between 1861 to 1865 the Civil War? Now, during the late 19th century, the war had many names, including the Abolition War, the War between the states, and the Rebellion. As Reconstruction was abandoned while the nation permitted the rise and normalized racial terror regime within the construct of Jim Crow, many white Northerners sought to bridge the divide with their Southern counterparts by using a more neutral term. By the 1890s, the Civil War was the chosen term. In the early 20th century, Congress officially adopted the term Civil War over the Rebellion. So it took approximately 4 decades to settle on the term the Civil War. Having a greater understanding of the origins of the name, going forward, I think I'm just going to stick with the Rebellion. I think it's more fitting as I move forward. Now, Reconstruction period is the period between 1865 and 1877. It was a process of remaking America after the Rebellion. A critical portion of the process was the inclusion of Black men in political life. Not only the right to vote, but to run for elected offices. One of our first elected Black men was Henry McNeal Turner. Turner was known as a Black nationalist, reparationist, and minister. He was born in 1834 in South Carolina to free parents. At the age of 15, Turner worked as a janitor at a law firm. The firm's lawyers noted his ability and helped with his education. Turner was also called to the church. He joined the AME Church and became a licensed minister at the age of 19. In 1858, Turner entered Trinity College in Baltimore, where he studied Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and theology. Definitely a Renaissance man. Now, 2 years later, he became the pastor of Union Bethel Church. Turner cultivated friendships and relationships with important Republican congressional figures, including Ohio Congressman Benjamin Wade, one of the architects of the Wade-Davis bill. This unsuccessful Wade-Davis bill is one of the most essential stories within the nation's narrative that is often overlooked. Take the time to learn more about the Wade-Davis bill. It's very critical, especially to what we have going on here today as it relates to those that rebel against the Constitution. Turner would become a national figure by 1863 at the age of 29 when he was appointed by President Lincoln to the position of chaplain in the Union Army. Turner was assigned to the 1st U.S. Colored Regiment, making him the first African-American chaplain in history of the United States Army. Now, after the rebellion, Turner would return to the state of Georgia, where he quickly became active in political life. In 1867, he organized the Republican Party in Georgia, and the following year was elected a delegate to the Georgia State Constitutional Convention. In that same year, he was elected to the Georgia State Legislature. Although 27 African Americans were elected to that body, a coalition of white Democrats and Republicans declared the African American members disqualified and refused to seat them. Turner led a protest, and on September 3rd of 1868, he stood before the Assembly representatives and denounced the legislators who refused to seat the elected senators and representatives. The U.S. Congress eventually intervened and allowed Turner and the others to reclaim their legislative seat in 1870, 2 years later. Now, the state of Georgia has a peculiar history. I encourage you to look further into the history. Georgia becomes the fourth state in the United States in January of 1788. It becomes the fifth state to succeed from the United States in January of 1861, just a few months after the election of President Lincoln. They joined the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. They had this election. You have the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in February of 1870. And quite interestingly enough, Georgia becomes the last former Confederate state to be readmitted into the Union. And then we fast forward to 2021, where Georgia becomes one of the first states to unleash voter suppression laws. History is literally repeating itself. Joining me is notable attorney, former judge, former assistant public prosecutor, poet, historian, and my dear fraternity brother, Fanon Rucker. Thank you for joining me here with Got Time. I'm glad you had the time to join me here today.
Brother, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm glad to be here, glad to sit with you, rap with you. We talking about what I love, history.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into it, what's going on with you right now? I know that you stay active in the community. Yeah. You stay active in making sure that you are building a legacy for yourself. We share these roots. We both come from Indiana.
That's right.
Relocated here, making the Queen City our home. So if you just can tell us, what's going on with you nowadays and what you've been doing.
So you mentioned Indiana, born and raised in Gary, Indiana, the city right on the lake, city of the century, 1906 when it was founded. Went to Hampton University, where it was a continuation of the life that I grew up in. My parents were very serious about teaching us that Black history was not a month long, but it was 365 days long. And so going to a Black college, and particularly down south in the early 90s, it fortified my interest and my love and my understanding of how the world works and how I interact in that world. Came here for law school after I saw Rodney King being assaulted by several police officers, motivated me to want to be a lawyer, particularly a civil rights lawyer. So I came to Cincinnati, where I attended the University of Cincinnati. I graduated from law school. I became a prosecutor of all things. Never thought that when I had an earring in my ear, a high top fade, and a 5-finger ring growing up in Gary. But I was a prosecutor for a bunch of years. And then I went into private practice where I was doing civil rights work. I was arguing those police misconduct cases and discrimination and employment cases. And then I ran for prosecutor. And then I became a judge. I was judge for 13 years before I retired a few years ago. Went back into private practice. And now I'm the managing attorney of the Cochran Law Firm. We're in 30 states across the country. I run our Cincinnati office where I do police misconduct, police brutality, personal injury, trucking accidents, wrongful death. I'm also the senior advisor of the Center for Social Justice at the Urban League's Holloman Center, where we help to bridge the gap between police and community so that we don't have critical incidences like we saw in 2020 when the center was first created as an entity. I also do what I'll say, I'm a special expert on a national court TV network. I'll say it like that, where I regularly appear and discuss high profile and low profile cases and intricate exemptions and exceptions to the law and how they actually affect all of us as citizens. I'm a grandfather times two. My baby girl and her husband just had baby number 2. So now they have 2 under 2. Now I used to have black hair, now I got gray hair, but every day is a good day for me. I enjoy life so much.
Well, I mean, you've done so much, you've accomplished so much, but what can I expect from a man, alpha man? You know, you've
right.
done your. I follow you quite a bit, and often we talk about presidential elections, and I want to start there with our conversation, and I find it fascinating. Presidential elections, in my take, has always been a polarizing concern in this nation. I mean, when you think about it, you know, Lincoln, you know, less than 4 months into his presidency, states succeed off of the threat of state rights, the state right to own human beings.
Yeah.
You know, and then you have Andrew Johnson, you have Ulysses S. Grant, and so forth. Can you talk a little bit, and then, you know, what we're dealing with today? Can you talk something about the presidential elections and what we just kind of unpack that, how polarizing it has been and is to this very day?
Yeah. So every 4 years, we as a country engage in this circus where everybody gets all excited. And it seems like in the 2000 election, when the Supreme Court had to decide in Bush v. Gore, that was absolutely the most crazy election we've ever experienced in this country. And then in 2004, when we had the Bush Part 2, when I think he was running against Kerry, and that was, oh my goodness, how many people lined up on either side and pointing fingers. I remember in 1980, I was only 9, but I remember Ronald Reagan running against whoever, I think it was McGovern, whoever the heck he was running against. But I remember the folks talking about Ronald Reagan had 3 6s on his knees and in the back of his head, and Ronald Wilson Reagan meant he stood for. I mean, they're always the most radical, crazy, horrible, polarizing elections ever, every single year. Certainly we saw this year. The reality is, outside of a couple of elections, most elections are only decided by somewhere between 5 and 7 points, or 5 and 7 point difference. It's very rarely a 20 or 30 point victory for one side or the other.
You're talking about the popular vote.
That's right. You're talking about the popular vote. And there's only been 3 elections where, well, I'll say this. Before 2012, there were only 3 elections where the popular vote and the electoral vote disagreed. And one of those is around the same time that we're talking about today, and that was right after what prompted Reconstruction to end. And we'll talk about that. But the idea of presidential elections is, by its very nature, a polarizing and contentious engagement between 2 sides that disagree. One of the things that was fascinating to me in law school was I read all these cases when I was sitting in those classes. And every case had a name: Jones versus Smith, Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Every case had 2 names. Why? Because there was one side that believed and argued one thing, and there was the other side that believed and argued something else. And both sides had what they believed to be equally valid or overwhelmingly supported arguments based on the law. That's why we made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and while we were reading these cases, because along the way, each side was able to present what was believed to be valid arguments. And just as much as those lawyers and those legal teams argued different sides of the same issue, our country experiences that in a very real way when we go to the polls. There's somebody who represents these particular interests, and there's another person who represents these other interests. There are people under those interests, and there's people under those interests. And those positions clash because both sides believe they're equally entitled to the position that they're taking, and the other side must be wrong. So by its very nature, presidential elections are representative of that clash and that chaos.
And so, you know, and I think about this when you go back to that time period, and I talk about Lincoln, and then I think about Grant. Christy Coleman, who's one of my colleagues in the public history field. She came to the Freedom Center to speak, and she presented that Ulysses S. Grant is the first civil rights president. And I never thought about it that way because a lot of the Civil Rights Act, the original ones,
1875,
fell underneath his administration and things of that nature. And I want to talk about the legacy of Black folks in political life. I'm under the belief, whether we're starting with Eram Rhodes Revels all the way to President Barack Obama, okay? It seems as if it's fine for Black folks to vote as long as the selection candidates meet a certain demographic. But the moment that Black men and Black women run for these offices, there's something wrong with the system. And so can you speak a little bit about this legacy about, Black participation in political life?
All right. So first of all, let's talk about when that participation had its genesis, had its current day genesis. You mentioned a little bit about the time period that we're talking about, and that was the period right after the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And I got to be honest with you, I taught Black legal history at the University of Cincinnati for a number of years. I lecture and teach history on behalf of the Masonic organization. I'm a 33rd degree Mason, and I'm also a statewide officer, and that's one of my roles is to lecture on history. And I love talking about that period right around the 1876 election. Mm-hmm. I love talking about that history. I love it because when we talk today about political parties and the dichotomy of what those parties represent ideologically, it was so different back then. I love that period because it was about 20 years after the Dred Scott decision, which was such an impetus to the Civil War, but it also was the only case in United States American history where we could find they defined or where they diminished the value of a people to a specific letter, where they declared that there is no right that any Black man has, that any white man is bound to respect. That was the most learned men in the world sitting atop the high seats of the Supreme Court in black robes, a legacy of justice and fairness, looking at a document and declaring, when it came to Black folks, that was our value, that we had none.
And you're talking about Roger B. Tandy.
Tandy?
Chief Justice.
That's
first,
right.
Tandy. The first Catholic person to hold that position as Chief Justice. I find that fascinating, giving how religion also intersects and plays a role. But please continue.
So just 20 years later, we had the Civil War had ended, and you had this deal, which I don't know if we're going to get into, where you had the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. Mm-hmm. Rutherford B. Hayes, who was out of Columbus, liberal Republican, and then Samuel Tilden, who was from the New York Bourbon Conservative Democrat Party. I mean, what were they about? But the Conservative Bourbon Democratic Party out of New York. We know that there was no Tilden president, so we know how the election turned out. But what that election did, and that went to the courts to be decided, just like in 2000 with Bush v. Gore. Mm-hmm. And when they manipulated the courts in order to make that decision, the agreement was that after this election, we're going to pull all the federal troops out. But what had happened between 1865 and 1877? My goodness, in those 12 years, I think I've read that about 2,000 Black folks served in elected office between local, state, and federal positions. We don't have 2,000 now, we do, but that was 10 years, 20 years after the Supreme Court declared that Black folks had no value. And even though we know that there was a 13th and a 14th and 15th Amendments, we also know that those had to be ratified by the states. And we know that there were some states that were slow to ratify. As we mentioned, Georgia was like, I ain't going, we're not going to do it. And even South Carolina, I'll tell you this, in 2004, South Carolina had to put on the ballot whether it was going to throw out their laws that said Black folks and white folks can't marry. Mind you, it's been unconstitutional for a long time. It was 2004 that passed by like a 52% to 48% margin. So, I mean, we talking about the will of the majority or the resistance of the will of the majority. So the idea that right after the Supreme Court had declared black folks had no value, and that we were so close in time to having been as a people declared to be less than. I mean, like specifically declared to be less than, not the dressing where they say, well, no, equal rights and equality. It was right after that time that there was such a guttural and such a powerful movement of black folks to be engaged in political activity that there were black conventions. Mm-hmm. You know, we had them here in Ohio, where and my man Martin Delaney, oh my goodness, I'd love to talk to you all day about Martin Delaney and Frederick Douglass and how he was the co-author of the North Star. Again, I taught history too, y'all saying, so I mean, I start, but we had these conventions. Black folks were creating towns where they were running them. I mean, it was a very remarkable time in our history. Hiram Revels, who we talked about, I believe in 1861. He
out of Mississippi.
Out of Mississippi. And whose seat did he take? He took the seat of Jefferson Davis when he went and started another country down south. And that, I mean, the irony of that. He was a black man who was elected in 1861 before they were actually free for the seat of the person who said the reason that we stepping away is because we wanted our Constitution the right to have slavery. I told you, I love that period of time. We talk about the Confederate States of America versus the United States of America. So the legacy of black folks being involved in politics, if you look at Hiram Revels, and you look at Neal Turner, and you look at Robert Smalls, and you look at PBS Pinchback, who was the first black governor of Louisiana, first black governor of any state, and it just so happened it was during the same time of Reconstruction. Reconstruction forced America to say, wow, I have the present memory of what we were doing to these people. We need to allow growth. And the country was forced, not willingly always, but it was forced to accept the gains and the interest of black folks of being engaged, involved, and they let it happen. They let it happen. I don't know if they could have stopped it because of the rush of feeling that these black folks had during the time, but the gains were incredible. And what we know is, if it had not been for the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, there would have been no need for a second Civil War during the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. Because again, the gains that had been made in education, in politics, in business, in education, in all of these areas was so torpedic after the Civil War that we were on a course of having a nation that represented and understood equality until that Hayes-Tilden Compromise undid everything. The black codes were passed and Jim Crow laws followed and everything else. And the next 100 years almost reversed all of those gains, which required what we saw in the 60s.
And I think that was able to happen because in these southern states, in many of these southern states, the population was vastly different. Right. In some states, you had more former enslaved people or newly free black men, and I want to make sure that understanding that when we're talking about black folk during this time, women, it would be 50 years later before women of any race would be able to get to vote. So we see how slow this country is moving to provide civil liberties to women, and especially coming off the heels that we just had a woman running for presidency, but the numbers were there, how they were able to be elected. But there was also the threats that were taking place that kind of led up to what you're talking about, that election in 1876, which led to the Compromise of 1877, which marks the end of that Reconstruction period.
Whiplash. And we're talking about what happened then. And, we talk about history repeats itself and learning from the lessons of the past. I personally believe, and I've talked about this in other venues, I believe that we are experiencing a parallel whiplash right now.
Yep.
And the whiplash that was experienced in 1876, 1877 did not meet with the resistance that it should have because it was whiplash. It was, well, wait a second, we moved too fast, too quick, allowing all of these people to go into these positions. And that's why the Supreme Court in 1878 said, well, we're going to find that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is unconstitutional. And it took until 1967 or 1965 until the second Civil Rights Act where they changed the language, and then the Supreme Court said, we're going to co-sign on it this time. I mean, we're talking about people recognizing of goodwill, and I'm critical of Lincoln. I'm critical of Abraham Lincoln. He's someone that I speak about often, and for the longest time, I think even now, Black folks have always held up Lincoln as one of their saviors, as somebody who freed Black folks. That's what he did. He freed Black folks. That's what I learned in school. I learned the 13th Amendment freed slaves.
That's what I call the watered down version, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Lincoln was a white supremacist. Lincoln said, I would rather not have to do this, but to save my country, I would do this. He would rather have Black folks been deported back to some other country. In fact, it was under his administration that the Back to Liberia movement got support.
But you know what I find fascinating about that? I find Lincoln to be very complex, and I agree with you. And what we haven't learned in school is that, why was he assassinated? John Wilkes Booth. Who is this man, John Wilkes Booth? Why did he assassinate? The last address that Lincoln had, he mentioned in that address about contemplating allowing Black men to vote and to participate in political life. It was a consideration because without those Black men and women that served in the Union Army, the Union would not have won.
That's right.
That is fact.
Yep.
They would not have won. And so in his mind, he started to make a concession with that. And it's fascinating that you talked about how he talked about it, but he makes this announcement, and John Wilkes Booth, who's a Confederate sympathizer, decides to assassinate him just 2 weeks later.
That's right.
And so I agree with you. I think we often get this watered down version of a lot of our history, but including the tenure of Lincoln as well. Yeah,
agreed. But so I offered Lincoln to say, however we see him, what he did, whether it was for patriotism, whether it was because he was starting to have a change of heart about the value of Black folks, whether it was because he was so lost and didn't know what to do because that had never been something that any president had ever experienced before in this country, he took the steps that he took and the declaration that he made, whether they were done for altruistic reasons, what it allowed folks to do was to recognize that they had the ability to participate and that they had the ability to fight. And every once in a while, there would be either law on their side or there would be other people who of like minds would say, I'm behind you and I'm going to support you as well. It doesn't really matter to me whether Lincoln thought well of my great-great-grandfather or not. It doesn't matter to me. What mattered to me is that when the Emancipation Proclamation was decreed and said, at this time I declare all Black folks under the sound of my voice free, even though they were already free, and it was like us declaring that.
Well, in the rebel states.
Well, that's my point.
That's
my point. So let's talk about that. So what we had was the United States of America, and then we had a separate country called the Confederate States of America. The United States had money. The Confederate States of America had money. I actually have some old Confederate state dollars that I picked up over the years. The United States of America had a constitution. The Confederate States of America had a constitution. The United States of America had an election. The Confederate States of America they were two separate countries. So essentially the Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all those slaves in that other country that were now free is like the United States declaring that all folks in England who work at GE are now free. It had no authority, legal authority. It had emotional authority. It had moral authority, but it had no legal effect. But because of that moral authority, because of that intention, because of what people perceive it did, Lincoln has been elevated to a position of greatness, I think, in the Black community, regardless of what he personally believed. And that's what I offer. whether or not people want to look at the specific motives or likes or dislikes of a particular individual, you got to look at how their actions impacted, whether positively or negatively, your legacy or your actions. And that's, again, with a lot of historical figures. But we're talking about the legacy. You mentioned about Lincoln saying, look, these black folks who were participating in the Union Army, we use political examples like Robert Smalls. Mm-hmm. Robert Smalls was a Navy captain who, for the Union Army, was able to steal a Confederate ship.
Or Mr. Westmoreland, he would like to say he liberated the planter.
That's right. And delivered it to the hands of the Union soldiers. And understanding how we look and how many presidents have we had since the Civil War that were prior military folks? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're called commanders in chief, and for the longest time,
and we just had a brother let go that has a long standing position. So once
brother, again, literally, yes. A fraternity brother,
yes,
who was the highest ranking military officer in the country, let go. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we'll get to it, but the conversation about DEI and affirmative, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion for what it perceives to offer to people. But beyond that, but Robert Smalls was in line with those elected officials or those politicians or those people who become heroes in military fighting for patriotism that then are able to utilize that celebrity in order to obtain political positions.
Right.
He was elected and served very successfully. And what did you talk about the legacy of black elected officials, many of those who rose high in the ranks in politics during that period were responsible then because they were educated. They said, we're going to focus our efforts, or we're going to lend a lot of our name and recognition and influence to creating educational opportunities for black folks. And so that's how you had the seeds planted for Florida A&M University, how you had the seed planted for Southern University, how you had the seed, because these elected officials said this is important because education, like George Washington Carver used to say, education is the key that unlocks the door to freedom.
And isn't that fascinating? When you look back at the history, there's been a concerted effort, especially with the black community, that education is your way of uplift. And so find it peculiar and fascinating that now education being devalued in the way that it is. And it's intentional. It's very intentional. I want to talk a little bit. We're talking about Reconstruction. We're revisiting Reconstruction. I want to also revisit the rise of Jim Crow. Now, the Jim Crow has a long runway in my take. It goes from 1865, which is at the end of the Civil War, all the way to 1968. And it's kind of talking about what we're talking about, this presidency. I like to say 1865 because after Lincoln is assassinated, there's a man that is elevated to commander-in-chief by the name of Andrew Johnson out of the state of Tennessee, the same state where the Ku Klux Klan was founded in December of 1865, I would say. Mm-hmm. And he comes into office and he pardons a lot of these Confederate leaders.
That's right.
And it is my take, that is the opportunity to plant those seeds of what would evolve with Jim Crow that would come a strong reality, after the abandonment of Reconstruction. Can you speak a little bit about that presidency in that point in time?
That was an immediate backlash. That was almost like immediately after Obama is the president, you have a Donald Trump who's elected president. You had Abraham Lincoln, who navigated the country through its breaking up, brother fighting against brother, depressions and riots. And the response was, we need to elect somebody who has a completely opposite view of relationships between races and how we view those who actually tried to destroy the country in rebellion and in forming another country and recruiting other countries to come and fight us to take over the United States. And Johnson said, "Hey, no problem. We'll forgive him." And in fact, all of those folks who are looking to go down and help to rebuild, we're going to let them we're going to give them support and we're going to let them rebuild on their own because we're not going to lock them away or we're not going to try them for treason and have them hanging from the gallows as many would have had them do. But also we know that he was a consummate racist. And so he encouraged the rollback of what ultimately would be what Lincoln was trying to do. He opened the door for states to say, we are not allowing this. That was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the Night Riders, the Democratic Party, which bore out of that. And again, we can talk about the historic shift of ideology of the parties, but that was born out of what I said, that whiplash from where we had come and people trying to hold on to power that they believed was starting to slip away or that they were starting to lose attention that they had been able to hold on to unobstructed for so long.
Yeah, that was the first "Make America Great Again"
I believe
campaign.
Well, I think I saw some campaign button from 1869.
With you being an attorney, there's also, when we talk about this time period, the latter part of the 19th century, there's one case that I find fascinating. I want to have a conversation with you about, and that's the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. And you talked about the different names. The thing that stood out to me, and for those that are viewing on YouTube, we definitely want to post a picture. I remember I'll talk about this case, learn about this case all the time. But one time I just had I'm like, well, let me just pull up. I'm curious about. I pulled up Plessy.
What he look like?
Yeah, Adolph Homer Plessy. And when I pulled up his picture,
Were you trying to find which one he is?
The man looked as if he could be a member of ZZ Top. Now I'm showing my age a little bit. Every girl's crazy about a sharp dressed man. You know what I'm saying? And then I had to dive in further. He was, I believe, considered an octoroon.
Yes, indeed.
But this case was on behalf of black folks, and it made me strengthen how entrenched this country is with the social construct of race.
Oh my gosh.
Although folks say they're tired of talking about race, but those that are in power put race at the forefront. And so what you're getting is our response back to that. Can you talk a little bit about that case?
Man. So first of all, when we talk about race cases, you had 1857 with Dred Scott, and you had the Civil War, you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th, that really didn't do anything, but don't get me started. And then you had 1896. We're looking at the turn of the century. We're looking at radical Reconstruction has been done for 20 years. We're talking about black codes, and we're talking about Jim Crow laws. And in 1896, we had separate but equal. That was the law of the land. And Plessy versus Ferguson was and when we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, we talk about all these major cases, they were not happenstance. They were deliberate strategies by civil rights groups to find ways to challenge the legitimacy of these laws. And so Plessy versus Ferguson was a deliberate attack on, it was a strategic attack on the concept of separate but equal. And so you had the Supreme Court, and I actually loved the decision. I mean, well, I don't love it for its ultimate conclusion. I think it was a correct legal conclusion, honestly. I think Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided, and if we get there, we can get there. But in 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States examined what is race, what exactly is equality, what is equal treatment. And one of the things that, and I say I love the case because there's not many cases that are philosophically interesting. Plessy versus Ferguson was a philosophically interesting case. You had, as you mentioned, someone who was 1/8 black. and now, first of all, you would have to say, well, when he's sitting in the white only section of the railway car, how did somebody walk down the aisle like, well, wait a minute, sir. Let me see. How did somebody who was a line worker making $2 a week, how was that person able to know that this person, who by all accounts was white, was 1/8 black? And what was the relevance of challenging somebody who looked like everybody else in that part of the car to be told you're in the wrong place, so that this law could be challenged. I would suggest to you that they were given notice that he was representing himself as an octoroon, that he had a drop of black blood in him, and that's why we have Plessy versus Ferguson. Because the visual of it allows for the absurdity of the separation of the race. Because if it's all about what I look like, then you should have left me alone. If it's because you got to go into my layers biologically to know that I have a drop of African blood in me in order to tell me I can't sit somewhere, that's absurdity in appearance. So he had to have told them, look here, I'm 1/8 black. Now, you gonna make me move? And that's where we end up with the case. But what the case talked about, the Supreme Court, oh my goodness. They said the Constitution requires equal treatment. It never allowed or required for equality of social interaction or intercourse. So it said, look, we're going to make a distinction between what we consider equal treatment and equal value. And I actually argued later on that that was one of the fallacies and problems of the 70 years, the 50 years after that, where the NAACP and other groups were going around arguing equal treatment. Because Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal is constitutional. If you want to have separate, that's fine. But you have to make sure that the accommodations are equal. What we know is that was great in law, but in practical truth, it was separate but unequal, which is how we end up getting the Brown versus Board of Education, where they decided between two different levels of argument. One was, it's not separate but equal, it's separate but unequal, and they could have argued it that way, as opposed to arguing what they did, that segregation itself is unconstitutional, when they argued that in order for me to feel equal as a little black boy, I got to be sitting in a class with little white kids. That was what Brown versus Board of Education said. It was deliberate strategy.
And that's the issue that you have with
that's
that.
That's the issue that I have. Absolutely. It was wrongly argued and wrongly decided for those reasons. Obviously, the outcome was the right one, but Plessy versus Ferguson was factually and legally true. And it was the precursor for, they said, well, that's not going to work as an argument, so we got to argue something else. But it really, and I really do encourage folks, it's a long argument, just like all those Supreme Court cases are, but I would encourage people to highlight and review that conversation about that issue. What exactly does it mean to be equal? We fought real hard for equal treatment. I want you to allow me to sit at your lunch counter. I want you to allow me to live in your neighborhood. I want you to, that's about equal treatment. Equal treatment does not encourage equal value. If the argument the whole time was that I am your equal, you will treat me with the same value as you have for yourself. That's saying you ain't got to give me anything because we're on the same level. When you're saying you have to allow me to live amongst you and you have to allow me the same accommodations, that's just saying I'm treating you equally, but it allows for a paternalistic supremacist view over the idea that I'm giving you your equality as opposed to me recognizing your equal value.
Wow.
So that's that, but Plessy versus Ferguson, to its natural conclusion, allows for equal value. Don't give me a piece of the pie. Allow me to have the tools to make my own oven so that I have my own pie. That's what Plessy versus Ferguson said. And that's why I said I love the decision and for the complexity of the conversation. I don't know that any other case, just like I don't know any other case in the country other than Dred Scott, identified the value of a whole people. I don't think there was any other case other than that one. Just like I don't think any other case other than Plessy versus Ferguson was so introspective in its discussion about the theory of race when it came to a decision about equality and equal treatment. It's just fascinating.
I want to, so we're talking about, the rise of Jim Crow, and then we go into the early part of the 20th century. And there are lynchings that are taking place. In my previous podcast, I talked about the People's Grocery out of Memphis and Ida B. Wells and her being a crusader of justice, bringing attention to all the lynchings, the killings that are taking place, black bodies swinging from trees, and so forth. And that means a lot to me, given that my father was born and raised in Mississippi. And at the age of 15, he had to elude a lynch mob for the fact of there was a white girl who thought he was cute. and so because of that, he enlisted in the Navy as a teenager. Young man, had to get permission. But I want to talk a little bit about black folks, or the black community's response to what's taking place. And what I feel often gets overlooked when we talk about these organizations that are forming, like the NAACP, our beloved fraternity, as well as a host of, the Urban League.
Reparation societies were meeting annually.
The Niagara movement.
Yes.
Can we speak a little bit about that, the Niagara movement, and how that was such a precursor and the foundation for a lot of these organizations that will be formed throughout the century?
Yeah. So what we saw during Reconstruction was, as a community, black folks saying, we're going to operate within this structure that's set up. We're going to run for office. We're going to assimilate. We're going to be a part of this test case, the United States of America, from within, because clearly they're now prepared to mold us into society. And we saw that to some extent until we saw radical Reconstruction. Until we saw the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. Then we had Plessy versus Ferguson. And then from 1896 until, like I said, about 1930, 1940, you had these groups being formed that were separatist movements. I mean, the Nation of Islam grew during that same time period.
Marcus Garvey.
Yeah. And again, these were organizations, the NAACP and Urban League, not so much, but some of the others that we mentioned were saying, look, if this country is not going to treat you as equal, we're going to create these organizations where you are equal and where you will be able to thrive. We're going to start communities around the country. How many black folks fled west and created their own towns where they were bankers and where they were teachers and where they were, business owners and seams? I mean, there were towns created by these ex-slaves who said, well, wait a minute, they're saying that I'm not going to have the same value. Well, fine, I'm going to go and separate myself, and I'm going to love myself within my borders. And that's what we started seeing during that time. Ultimately, was the goal assimilation of some of these groups? Well, arguably the fraternity, that's what, they were going to white colleges and, at least Alpha was, of course, with Omega and Sigmas and the rest of them, AKAs, Deltas, started at black colleges. But their goal was, we see the value of those type of associations. We can't get in, no problem. We'll create our own, and we'll create our own with our own boundaries. It was a small level, the Black Masons, but I mean, we got started in the 1770s on the same principles. They just on a much larger scale. And we talked about the fact that in the early 1900s, you used to have, well, actually for every year after slavery, they started having reparation conventions every year where black folks get together and they would formulate plans to actually get reparations. There was actually a bill pending by, I believe, Sumter that drew it up that would have paid ex-slaves in the same compensation level as former Civil War soldiers. They were going to give them pensions. And that's where we know the general's orders of 40 acres and a mule that was then undone when Jackson came. Well, no, it wasn't Johnson that came in. My mind just drew a blank. But it was those general orders that said, we're going to give you what you were promised. I mean, but all of these things kind of came to a powerful fruition in the early 1900s when we saw the greatest numbers of folks part of these groups, because that's where they felt their protection and that's where they believed that they were actually going to get their movement. But there were not any blacks that were serving in Congress during that time. There were no blacks in Senate. There were no black judges in Supreme Courts.
And so we went from, when we talk about a period where it was over, you talked about how many were in.
A couple thousand.
And then we're talking about.
In 10 years.
Yeah. And then a couple decades later, there's none.
There's none. And there weren't again for almost 100 years until the 60s. I mean, we talk about Thurgood Marshall, of course, was the first black Supreme Court justice, and that was by my favorite president, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, the civil rights, he gave the bravest speech of any president, in my opinion, when he said, "We shall overcome," on the floor of the House, which was what prompted the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I love that piece. But he's the one that appointed Thurgood Marshall to the court. He knew Thurgood Marshall's politics and his ideas and where he came from. So there was a whole gap between when it was to when it stopped. And again, it was 10 years when all that progress happened until that compromise knocked all those gains back and kept those gains from happening for another 100 years until there had to be more aggressive action by a larger group of people and a Supreme Court that had changed significantly by that time to focus on federal rights over states' rights, to allow for the Civil Rights Act to actually be implemented, passed, and supported, even though the South was still resisting, which is why the federal troops were who we had to rely on during the 60s to go and tell all those governors down South, you got to let these black folks get into school where we have the pictures. I mean, it's just, like, again, this is history, so I started running off because it's so much, and all of it is building blocks based on building blocks based on building blocks. Nothing happens in isolation when it comes to history. Like this happened as a result of what this happened over here. Where we are today is a direct consequence of those actions that were taking place in 1920 and 1950 and 1965.
Or what happened in 2008.
Or 2008, 2012. And here we are. And I am concerned about how long this whiplash is going to last. I'm not concerned it's going to be permanent. History says it's not. History says that even as, and this was how I started, even as outrageous and chaotic and unbelievable and new all this stuff is, it was just as new and chaotic and radical in 1876 when you had the riots and when you had PBS Pinchback as the lieutenant governor being appointed governor for 5 days. It was just as radical and crazy when Robert Smalls was elected. It was just, every time that we experience something that we've never experienced, it is the most outrageous and crazy. History says this looks a whole lot like some stuff that happened in another country about 70, 80 years ago, but nothing is permanent.
Right.
What is permanent is the fight, is the resistance. It should be the awareness, the study, and then the strategizing to respond.
And I want to get you out of here on this, because I know that you're taking your time, precious time out to be with me, and I want to bring you back because I feel as we need to do a part 2, so we can do that.
I'm with it.
I believe history. I'm a public historian. I believe history is applicable, meaning that you can apply the lessons from our forebears to navigate and mitigate the things that we're dealing with today. And so, from your take, what is it? How can we use our history, to inspire and incentivize us with what we're currently going through today?
Well, I'd say 3 ways. First of all, when I look at, and again, I just encourage people to look up Martin Delaney. Love Gleaves in South Carolina. I mean, there's so many people who accomplished so many things during their lifetimes. And so the first takeaway should be, we should not have in 2025 a sense of hopelessness or a sense that I don't have time to do. All the stuff them folks accomplished without Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, without cars, without cell phones. And we talk today about how we're too busy or don't have the energy to attend a meeting or to log on to a meeting to find out what's happening in our communities. We should abandon the idea of hopelessness based on our historical observations and teachings. That's number one. Number two is to recognize that every time we see a movement or we see historic figures who resisted, they were resisting what was considered legal in that time. Abolitionist movement was a resistance to what was legal. Martin Luther King got arrested and wrote a letter from Birmingham jail resisting a legal order not to march. Rosa Parks started the Montgomery bus boycott because she was resisting a law that said she couldn't sit at the front of the bus. Bruce Boyden, who was a Howard Law student, started or was the preemptor to the Freedom Rides when he got off that bus in Richmond, Virginia, and refused to get up when he was told you can't sit at this lunch counter, which ended up in the Supreme Court represented by a dude named Thurgood Marshall in 1958. All of those cases started by people strategizing to address what was considered legal. So people need to understand that from history.
I will put, and for those, I'm going to say it loud for those in the back, just because it's law doesn't make it right.
That's right. That is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct. And the third takeaway from history is just that. It's history. It's not permanent. Like the fact that we're talking about all these things is because they happened at some point and then things changed. In the context of us living it, oh my God, I'm in the middle of the trees. I can't see out of the trees. I can imagine that when the 1857 Dred Scott decision came down, people living in the middle of it, black folks were like, well, my goodness, what option is there at this point when I have no value? But here we are 170 years later with a whole different reality. At least I know for me, I got a different reality about them, what they said and what they believe. And I know a whole bunch of other folks that do as well. And so it's history, which means, like with the stock market, it's bad today, but just hold on. It's gonna get better. It ain't gonna get better by attrition. It's not gonna get better if we don't act. Mm-hmm. But don't wallow in the difficulty of right now. Realize that history teaches us that it's a temporary condition, and that if you fight, which you can and you must, that your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will be living a different reality than what you perhaps suffered through or had angst about when you were going through it in that moment. Those are the three kind of takeaways.
Well, I appreciate you being here. I got to definitely bring you back. As I said, for those who have not, please like, subscribe, and share. And I'm going to conclude with this to my listeners with, first of all, thanking you, Brother Rucker, for joining me here today. The authentic truth of our history, it reveals a lot. I think one that's very important is that it is the strength of our past that where we should be hopeful. Even though the dark sky is rising, although I said that we're in the age of incivility, we must guard our hope. I believe the lawyer Stevenson. I heard him talk a few times. He talked about, He talked about guarding your hope, and we need to do that. But you know, I'm a historian. I'm in education, and one of the things is that history shows that insecure people behavior often bends towards injustice. It often bends towards violence when they are uncomfortable. And we have a lot of people that have been and are uncomfortable. And it's from this discomfort that there's this level of fear. And they act instead of believing in their own gifts and talents. But we must lean into our own gifts and talents and remain hopeful. And so I want us to lean into education. Although the structure may devalue education, history shows that education has been a critical part of our uplift. And so we need to have that education. We need to understand our history. And so amid these times, every now and then I like to raise up a book. And this right here is Dark Sky Rising, Reconstruction, the Dawn of Jim Crow, by one of my fellow historians and scholars, Skip Gates. Y'all know him as Henry Louis Gates Jr. But when I met him a few times, he was like, call me Skip. So I'm calling him Skip. And this is one of these books that can educate. It's for young readers. I mean, we're talking about teens all the way up. But to me, when we're talking about Reconstruction, we're talking about the rise of Jim Crow and things of that nature, this book here provides you with some insight of how we've been overcome these times, and so that it can raise your level of hope as we go through our current times today. We need to learn from our forebears that came before us. And you can begin with this book as a resource, Dark Sky Rising by Henry Louis Gates Jr. I would like to thank our special guest, Fanon Rucker. I would like to thank our viewers and listeners. This is Got Time with Christopher John, your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Know thy history.